Mhm. I am actually Mr. Nobody. When I was, oh, it's that thing. I won't compete with it. Thank you. When I was four, my first job in my dad's gas station was chopping ice up and scattering it over the Coke machine. You know, they were ice chests in those days and not refrigerated. When I was six, I was pumping gas and watching the pumps. But when I was 10, they found out I could draw and they sent me to the art center. And so instead of getting dirty with grease and oil, I got dirty with clay and chalk and worked for as a commercial artist for a number of years. Then went on to other things. If you remember the old 7-Up sign with the rainbow and the flowers, that was one of my projects. And I left the commercial art field and went on to pastoral ministry, and I've been doing that for 50 years. So I've been around the block a few times. I've worked at Costco cleaning toilets. I've worked as a roofer and a carpenter. I've worked as a plumber, and I've built a couple of houses, and so the list goes onward and upward. Right now, was supposed to be working as retired, uh, but in between time, I managed to complete a couple of master's degrees and a doctoral degree. And my last big job was working for the largest university in the Western Hemisphere as a doctoral advisor for the doctoral program. Tried to keep people from getting themselves stuck, tried to keep them from making a fool of themselves with their dissertation. It's kind of like herding cats. It doesn't work. So I want to give a shout out to Ron. Ron, please stand. Everybody take a look at Ron. He says he needs a haircut. So does my wife. Ron put the tape together and put all of this up for us. He built our website. He runs a farm called Baumgartner Farms. He is also in charge of drylander design and web development. And so, he's a good friend, and he's pieced all this together for us. And this is what we're going to use to guide us through the evening. I want to say right up front that none of the Clovis or Windus people who lived along the edge of the ice and hunted mastodon, none of them left us a record of what happened when the ice dam broke and when everything washed out and all of this unique geology and scablands and what have you happened. But we experienced that, and so I'm an educator. Uh, I'm not a scientist. All of my degrees are in history and religion and those sorts of things. They're all in the humanities, and so I look, and I'm trained to do this. I look at things for what's missing. It's called reflective critical thinking. So when I look at something, I see what is it that's missing here in this. And one of the things that's missing with the discussion of ice age floods has nothing to do with rocks and geology, has nothing to do with science. It has nothing to do with research on how these developed. And bless the Canadians, I love my fishing hole in Jameson Lake. But but the fact of the matter is that there is a human side to this story, and the human side to this story began in 1883. People did not come here. They did not explore here because they couldn't get here. And the reason they couldn't get here has to do with the fact that there is this big, huge wall of basalt at uh, Banks Lake. There's another big, huge wall of basalt in Moses's Coulee. And there's all of the washout and the damage and the creek beds and everything that put Waterville Plateau as the largest, cut it out and left it as the largest plateau on Earth. But very, very hard to find and get to. There were no maps. There were no means of gaining access to the Waterville Plateau. And so while there was three men that wandered off from the Civil War and wound up at Mansfield, apart from that, the actual settlement of the Waterville Plateau didn't start taking place until 1883. And because of them, we have this concept, and this is what was missing. We have this understanding of how very difficult the landscape of Douglas County really is. We whiz up the highway and go up on top of the plateau and on to Spokane, and it just seems so nice and easy, but that wasn't true. It was very difficult to arrive here. Among all of those things in 1883, part of the push to settle here came from newspapers that carried all kinds of wonderful advertisements about what it was like to actually live out west. There's free land out there. There's all kinds of wonderful resources, lots of water, lots of land, and it's all free. It's for your taking, and they even have beautiful women to offer. Yeah, the newspaper ad, of course, actually said that. And then there were the brochures and the books, and quite honestly, one of the best descriptions of Oregon, Washington was written by Dr. Whitman. And he published that book, and it was still available, and people would read it. One of our pioneers that came to Douglas County in 1883 was a young man, 20 years of age, and he saw the newspaper article that said there's this wonderful place with beautiful women, and you need to come here because there's free land for anybody that's willing to work hard. And so he left his home near Kansas City, and he joined up with a wagon train, and he made his way out here, and he turned north. But this area had not been explored, had not been developed. There were no roads, there were no maps, and the landscape was difficult. It was very difficult. And so we can start this video now. John Smith, who founded Orondo, came on the very first the very first stagecoach out of Spokane west. And it followed a cow trail. They sent a pathfinder out ahead, and they planned out their path and how they were going to get to places like Cottonwood Springs. We know it as Davenport. And he got on that stage, and when they got to Deep Creek, it was uncovered. It didn't have sides on it. It was just an open wagon with benches. And so when they got to Deep Creek, they literally pitched him over the back of the stage and into the creek head first. And he rode, dunked in ice water and covered in frozen clothing for the next 10 hours while they worked their way to Davenport. And that was the kind of trip that he took. And I don't know, he never explained how they got through Moses's Coulee. Most of the pioneers had to go from down through the creek bed south of Davenport and over to Ephrata and then north up into Moses's Coulee. And literally there was not a trail, but they made a trail coming up the creek bed where Highway 2 runs now. That was the nature of the land. And until 1893, the need for roads connecting the dots on the map didn't exist. And nobody tried. And we have as a result these wonderful pictures of that time period and these things that happened. And so in 1896, Doria invented the first car built in the United States. And from that building of that car, the next year they made 13, and they got this big corporation together and they built a whole 13 cars during the year. But it exploded. The car was so important technologically that people were buying them and the people were running them. And as the slide says, the spark was lit. They had to have one. Everyone had to have one. And the 485 companies within the next decade started building cars. We're down to what, four? You see this little guy right here? 1907 Ford Model 2. That represents more than twice the income of the average person. And yet Ford sold 15 million Model Ts over the lifespan of the car being built. And that had an impact sociologically. It had an impact historically. And you had rickety things like this, and yet people still plunked down $650 for that thing with one cylinder and a stick to turn it. It was a wagon, and that's all it was with a motor in it. And so there's 23,000 of those built, and there's 15 million of the Model Ts built, and we're looking at a frenzy. Literally, we're looking at a frenzy. When we see these companies entering the business and we see the totals, take a look at the total number of cars built before 1909 or 1912. I mean, it's an unbelievable total. You can move on. Yeah, here's the production figures. $373,000 cars were built, but there were no roads. This picture, taken at the Waterville Roundup, Big Bend Roundup in Waterville in 1914, there are 50 cars, and there was no way to drive one off or on to the Waterville Plateau. No way to get there. The ingress and the regress didn't exist. And so you have all of these cars and all of these people that are gathered, and they came in on trails. This is the road from Waterville to Orondo up until 1915. It would not even, it took a horse and a wagon, or a 4-horse hitch and a wagon, 4 hours to go down that road. It took 8 hours to come back. And there was 22% grade, rocks everywhere. And so this problem was seen by Sam Hill, who was executive of the Great Northern Railway. He built the railroad track that brought the cars into Douglas County. Here's the meeting. He's the guy in the center with the fancy coat, and his wife is standing in front of him on a rock. This is at Vantage. And they called together all the bicyclists and drivers and people of interest and business people, and formed what they called the Good Roads Committee. And they pushed the state of Washington, literally pushed the state of Washington into forming a highway commission and actually building or declaring roads. The roads didn't exist. The fact of the matter is they left the whole of the scenery of automobile out of their thinking. The state governments, the county governments, the federal government didn't want to do anything with this issue of automobiles. They had cow paths, and the cow paths wander here and wander there. Actually, we might think that all of that went away and that in the 20th century we had all good roads, right? Wrong. In 1946, my parents had 6 flat tires and drove and got stuck in mud 4 times between Albia, Iowa and Des Moines, Iowa, because the highway that was marked was nothing more than dirt. The same thing was true. The same thing was true in 1953, and we went to North Carolina to a family funeral and got lost because the roads were not paved, they were not marked, and yet it was called a U.S. highway. So we're watching a flyover here that's going to take us up the river and up to Orondo. There's the Otabashian Bridge. And it's going to take us up to Orondo. There's what's called Turtle Rock. It used to be called Lion Rock. And if you look at it from this side, you can see the lion. and Orondo. Orondo was settled by John Smith, a medical doctor, who came in 1883 to Douglas County, and he wound up down in Orondo, fortunately for him, because he had tried up on the top and found no water, and he gave up and walked down to the mountainside, literally. This road that goes up, there's the red road, that's the current road. The blue road was built in 1915. Look at all the zigzags in that thing. It was literally carved, hammered out of a cliff by state prisoners. Literally hammered out of a cliff by state prisoners. Corbaley Canyon, all of this from the graffiti rock in Pine Canyon down to Orondo is actually Corbaley Canyon. And that's where that rocky road picture we had. And so when you drive up this thing, you're driving up the steepest, longest grade in the US highway system. It is 7 miles long and 6% grade and 30 curves. I've drove it so many times I've counted them. That's crazy. So there's a graffiti rock, the one to the right with the trees, that was Corbaley Canyon. That's how the pioneers came down. They changed it over to Pine Canyon and came down the Prisoner Road, that zigzag thing there, carved out of a rock cliff, and on up to the top and the big horseshoe, and then on to Waterville. We call it Pine Canyon, but it's more Corbaley Canyon than it is Pine Canyon. With all of its steep valleys, all of its cliffs, all of its falling rock, the fact of the matter is, this is a result of the Ice Age flood. And the people who lived there were deeply troubled by this. In order to get lumber from Badger Mountain down to Orondo, they had to go north to Brown Canyon, 8 miles, and come down Brown Canyon and float the wood down to Orondo and bring it back on shore, because there was no way to take it down Corbaley Canyon. There was no way to do it. So you see the Corbaley Canyon as the red, and you see the black as current Pine Canyon Road, and the blue was the Prisoner Road that was carved out of rock. Those sharp zigzags were carved out of a cliff. They've collapsed now. You go look at it. You can stand at the end of the road and look down and see all the collapsed rocks and what's left of the pavement. Personally, I wouldn't hike down there, but people do. It's a little risky. And this is a direct result of all of the ice and all of the water that flowed down the Columbia and flowed off of the plateau and left all kinds of really crazy, wild geological features in the path. One of the hardest things to ever accomplish was getting this road to go up through the Moses Coulee, because it's 300-foot cliffs. It's not like it slopes off where this washed out and the river helped with all the Ice Age floods. It is just sheer cliff and carved out, now I understand, by the Canadians from Canada. So you have in the midst of all of this, all kinds of washouts, all kinds of torn up land. You have rocks left that are bigger than a ship in the middle of nowhere, and piles of rocks and all kinds of erratic rocks laying everywhere, and some of them standing up. And you look up at them and say, how in the world did that happen? And so the US Highway 2 is simple to us. You can go on. But it wasn't simple. It was not simple. Smith had to walk down to Orondo. There was no way to even get his horse down at that point. And the pioneers literally faced this everywhere in Douglas County. There's a record of one of the pioneer families that arrived at Okanogan. Doesn't exist anymore. Okanogan was the first town in Douglas County within 100 miles, and it was a tent. And there was absolutely not one thing there other than the tent and a map and directions on how you stake your land. That's the only thing that was there. They couldn't buy anything there. And so all of that was changed starting in 1909 because the railroad came to Waterville and Mansfield, and it brought cars in by the hundreds, and by the hundreds people bought them. With that came a need to get those cars on and off the plateau. These are more pictures of Corbaley Canyon here, and these pictures are really dynamically truthful. Those boys are picking up rocks and moving them out of the path because they tended to tumble back down, and then you couldn't get through, and mom and dad sent them down there. I don't know what he's holding the stick up to do. There's another part of the Corbaley Canyon path, and you can see the steep cliffs. There's a mud hole with a 22% grade that was part of Corbaley Canyon. So in 1915, they brought in the prisoner crew. And when they brought in the Walla Walla State prisoners, they pretty much let them work without a lot of supervision, but they hammered and they chiseled and they shoveled that entire cliff away. And after they shoveled the cliff away, they shoveled a road out, a switchback that came down very tight, very steep, and finally wound up down in the bottom of the rock basin, in the bottom of the gully washed out that we call Pine Canyon. They got paid 50 cents an hour that was held in bay for them until they were finished chiseling the rock. And in 1916, they were rewarded, some of them anyway, the ones that behaved themselves. 60 out of the more than 100 prisoners endured to the end and received a farewell dinner. They received their pay. They received commutation of their sentence. This was not just true in Douglas County. This was also true up the Waterville Highway. You can still see off on the west side where they carved out of a cliff where there's a steep bridge going up there. There's the honor camp right there. And you notice there's not any fences around it. That's the prisoner camp. And from there, that's above the graffiti rocks. Graffiti rocks are right below there. And from there, they went up into the hills and they worked for a year straight. And these are the cliffs that they chiseled through. Yeah, wow. We don't see those because those are down at the bottom. Those are below the highway. Where you go through the cut through, some of those cliffs are there. Some of them are back up on the hillside where they chiseled. And these cars could actually make that road work, but it was so steep that there was a spring right where that one stopped, and they'd stop to refill the radiator and let their car cool down. And that spring stayed there until in the 70s, but up on the highway above, because the older cars didn't have pressurized systems and they would overheat. And overheating was a common problem. People would actually drive down that road when it was finished just to have a picnic down there in the grove. Because on the Waterville Plateau, the only trees are up on top on Badger Mountain. The ones that have been planted since are great, but there were no trees. It was an open prairie, an empty land, and dry land at that. This is the big bend, and this is just beyond the cliff that they carved out. Notice the rocks along the road and the rocks on the roadbed. And all of this led up to what we call the Sunset Highway. Now, a piece of that runs down through East Wenatchee along the river. It is the whole route all the way up to Waterville and all the way across to Spokane. They named it that, they declared it that, and there wasn't a road there, just a cow path. And they didn't have a way to go from Coulee City over through Moses Coulee. See, then all of this was set off by a transcontinental auto race. There had been a couple of auto races, one in Chicago, that's kind of set off the explosion with people wanting to buy cars. But in June of 1909, the first automobile in the race arrived in Seattle going to the exposition. They wanted to get to the exposition. We have a sewing machine in the museum that's a hand crank, and it says Yukon on it. And the reason it says Yukon is because it was sold at the Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909, 1910. And they carried it home and wore it out. See, the contest with the auto endurance race began in New York City and ended at the exposition in Seattle. And it took 23 days for that first car to arrive, but it was an absolute disaster for those drivers. Guggenheim kind of spurred on the idea and got the AAA and the Alaska Yukon Pacific Expo involved, and he sponsored the contest. He put up the prize money. He put up the prize, and it was sanctioned by the Automobile Association, the AAA. They've actually been around since 1902. And so all of this is a part of the picture, but it was this that actually drove them, the state and the US government, to work on the building a road that's usable. You see, this guy here was the person who actually set the path. He was the pathfinder. And as soon as they announced it, Henry Ford announced that they would put 2 Ford Model Ts with 20 horsepower engines into the race. Or 20 horsepower, I have a lawnmower bigger than that. 5 weeks after departing from New York, the Pathfinder limped into Pocatello, Idaho, and they had to ship him a new car on rail because they had worn it out. It was a disaster. And all he was doing is looking to find the right path so they could tell the racers where to go. That's what he was doing. And he finally arrived in Seattle. There's the car. Look at the shovels and the picks and the ropes and, and the bags of junk piled onto that car, and how dirty it is from making that trip. And so here's the start of the contest. So the contest began in New York City with a whopping number of 6 cars. And the president launched the thing, and by telegraph, literally, and set the start off. And here's a painting of the exposition itself on the university site. And in that exposition, there was a building dedicated to the building of highways. And there was all kinds of equipment and machinery and all kinds of styles of paving and that type of thing that was displayed. In this endurance contest, there were only the 6 cars. And the one that won the race was disqualified because he had replaced the engine someplace along the way. I think it was in Idaho. And he had replaced the drive axle when he broke it on Snoqualmie Pass. And it was an absolute, see the Itala, which is an Italian car, the Chalmette, the Acme, the Stearns, and 2 Model Ts were the cars that were entered. And so here's a picture of them. I have seen a couple of these. My dad's gas station, we worked on everything, and I drove a Duesenberg when I was 12 years old. Guy used it as a fencing car for his farm. And so there they are. Those are the cars that were entered into the race, and the 1909 Model T Roadster. But these 6 cars, their driver, their mechanic, went through all kinds of mud, rocks, quicksand, snow, and in and out of things that we would not consider driving in. After the contest, the Lincoln Highway was planned in 1913. It ran basically Highway 30 across the United States. The Red Trail was set up, which ran from Lake Huron across the northern tier states into North Dakota, and then the Yellowstone Trail. And here are pictures from the actual endurance race. Yeah. How about this one? Your car's stuck, you get out, even if it is knee-deep mud. Look at him sitting there and all the mud, and he's got his pants rolled up. So in 1912, a group of businessmen in South Dakota, way north in South Dakota, Ipswich, got irritated at the fact they couldn't even get to the next town over, to Aberdeen. And so they actually started pushing within their own county and talking to businessmen in the next county over, and they started what they called the Yellowstone Highway. And they worked literally town by town. And as they did work town by town, they pushed their way all the way to the East Coast and plotted out a road, and all the way to the West Coast and plotted out the road. And literally, this ran across the northern states. It ran across the north of Ohio and Pennsylvania and all the way across to the coast. But when it got to Washington, you see that big circle in Washington? Forget about the top piece. It wasn't there when they plotted the road. They went down all the way south through the Tri-Cities and over to Yakima and then north because you couldn't get through Douglas County, period. You could not get through because of the Ice Age floods and the damage done with all of the erratics and all of the washouts. And so here is Parmalee. He was the founder of the Yellowstone Trail, the guy with the inspiration. And true to his nature, he came out to out of South Dakota to Butte, Montana, in a train and took the car across through Washington, through Spokane to inspect. Here's a picture of him doing that. And you can see the route that goes down through Walla Walla and Dayton and those areas over there. Here's a trainload of cars being shipped into Washington, you know, with nowhere for them to go. How about this road? Have you thought about driving that one? Might with a four-wheel drive vehicle that's specially equipped. The more direct Sunset Highway would have been better, but Parmalee couldn't get from Coulee City to Waterville without going south to Ephrata and coming back. Wasn't possible. And they encountered the channel difficulty with long before it was ever investigated and written about. And so here's that trail, you know, and it shows it here dipping all the way down and going all the way back up. 285 miles. It was 135 miles when it went through Waterville. They took off over 150 miles off the trip. And at 25 miles an hour, which was average speed at that time, that would have been several days of driving that they took off of that trip. And the point with the Yellowstone Trail was, hey, people can get to Yellowstone National Park. And then they started pushing the states to pave these roads, and they started pushing the states to actually declare them. And they actually pushed Yellowstone until 1920 when they finally allowed automobiles in. You know, so all of these things are the human side of this great story about the Ice Age floods. See, these are the cliffs in Moses Coulee. Yeah. I guess the car is supposed to jump. The stuff at the bottom that's washed out, the scablands that are below are bad enough without the other. And you can barely see the telephone poles running along the brown grass there at the foreground. Telephone poles were part of the adventure because they went to Bell Telephone and actually got permission to paint on the posts a red stripe and a white stripe with an arrow saying, go this way, go that way. And so telephone poles all the way across from Lake Huron on the Red Trail part were painted, and they were painted in Waterville as well. And there was a gas station in Waterville that was declared the official Red Trail station. And it was put on their map. And we're waiting. There we go. Yeah, now you can see the telephone poles a little more clearly. Current road. Dyer Hill is a spot that's north, almost to the north end of the county. And this is the Cold Springs Basin. And look at the rocks. And this is actually part of Ron's farm. It's actually on his farm. It's an incredible piece of geology. Look at the cliffs. Look at the basalt. Look at the damage that was done with it being washed out by the Ice Age flood, pushed over and shoved over by glaciers and left. It's kind of an interesting piece of ground, but that's true all over Douglas County. And you have to scratch your head because there's a story of one of our pioneers who arrived in Okanogan and he looked at the map and his wife and him had been on the road for over a year. They got stranded in Wyoming because Native Americans had stole all the goods off the supply train and there wasn't anything to buy at the fort. And they finally got to Baker City in the fall, and it was too late to try to go over the Boo Mountains, which are now called the Blue Mountains. Uh, so they stayed there the winter, and when they headed on into Waterville, they went down to Ephrata, and then up the coulee until they got to the route that was, like I said, rough broken to go up the creek bed where Highway 2 runs now. And they finally got to Okanogan, this spot in the middle of nowhere with no maps, no guidance, no signs, no people to tell them which way to go. And that when they got there, they looked at the map and he said, "Oh, I want this spot right here." And so he looked at, there was a lake there, And when he got to the lake, here's this basalt washout with a pool of water and steep cliffs and no way to get to the water. And when he looked at the land he planned to stake, here are all these huge columns of basalt standing all over his property. Out of 160 acres, he might get 40 that was tillable. That was Douglas County. And all of the roads and all of the development happened because of the invention of the automobile. It's crazy. But sociologically, the things of this earth drive us. And so do we as people drive back and push back. Thank you so much this evening. We appreciate. Thank you for putting up with me and my craziness. And